Your move, Imperator.
There's never a cop around when you need one.
It must be admitted that The Omega Man is the only film that genuinely terrified me as a child. I was only about 7 or 8 years old at the time, but it made me believe that the familiar world around me could disappear overnight. Charlton Heston. Walking alone through the streets of Los Angeles, calling out for other people and receiving only cold echoes in return. The fear of there being no one left was far more frightening to me than any monster jumping out for a scare. That's how children are. Loneliness is truly cruel to them. Many years passed, and that childhood fear no longer followed me. But when I rewatched The Omega Man as an adult, I came away with a completely different perspective. Did you know that The Omega Man was once considered a move that nearly destroyed Charlton Heston's career? That Neville collapsing like a crucified Christ was no accident but a religious metaphor embedded directly into the script? Or that the white costumes of the family were designed to feel ritualistic rather than purely horrific? 15. The film nearly ruined Charlton Heston's career. Few people realise that The Omega Man 1971 was once considered a risky choice for Charlton Heston. After becoming an icon of grand historical epics such as Ben-Hur and the Ten Commandments, his decision to take the lead role in a bleak post-apocalyptic film about plague and isolation made many studio executives worry that he was damaging his image. Heston later admitted that the role of Robert Neville forced him to confront deep-seated fears about death and isolation. He described it as one of the most introspective roles of his career. Actor Anthony Zerbe also confirmed that Heston approached the role with an almost religious seriousness, viewing Neville as a symbol of humanity's last hope. These bold choices made the film controversial upon release, but they are also what allowed The Omega Man to rise above a conventional survival horror film and become a dark statement of the Cold War era. 14. This cult reflects Cold War fears of religious extremism and anti-civilization sentiment. Do you remember them? The followers dressed in black robes gathering by candlelight, chanting distorted prayers and vowing to erase every trace of science and technology. That is, the family, a fanatical religious cult that sees itself as the future of humanity. In The Omega Man, Robert Neville's greatest enemy is not only disease or isolation, but this cult itself. Moreover, the scenes of them advancing at night, carrying torches and crude weapons to hunt Neville, evoke the chilling familiarity of medieval purges transplanted into the ruins of a modern urban setting. This cult is a mirror reflecting a very real anxiety of the early 1970s. The rise of religious extremism as a reaction against science and civilization. In the context of the Cold War, when fears of nuclear annihilation, biological experimentation, and technology spiraling out of control loomed over American society, the family represents a turn away from reason, viewing science as sin, doctors as heretics, and knowledge as a threat that must be destroyed. Anthony Zerbe, who played Matthias, said in interviews that his character was constructed as a cult leader, born from collective fear rather than a simple villain. 13. The figures in black and the face of death. Do you remember the nighttime scenes when the family silently emerges on the empty streets of Los Angeles? Black robes covering their bodies, dark sunglasses hiding their eyes and faces pale as corpses under the flickering torchlight. That imagery was not created to scare in the conventional horror film sense. It was staged like an organised religious ritual. Enter the Omega Man. The family does not wear white, they wear absolute black, combined with faces powdered white and black sunglasses, creating an extreme visual contrast, black as night, white as a corpse. According to Anthony Zerby Matthias, the family does not see itself as monsters or as victims of the plague. They believe they have been purified, while the old world technology science firearms is a form of contamination that must be destroyed. 12. Christ's symbolism placed directly before our eyes. I still clearly remember the choking feeling when watching the final scene of the Omega Man, as Robert Neville collapses, blood flowing from his own body while the survivors quietly carry away the serum that can save the human race. At the time, I couldn't quite name that feeling. I only knew this was not simply the death of a character. It felt like a sacrifice. And that was no accident. Charlton Heston repeatedly acknowledged that he approached the role of Neville as a kind of reluctant messiah. Neville is the only person immune to the plague that destroyed humanity, and his blood is the source of the life-saving serum. This was intentional. In interviews, Heston said he viewed Neville as a man bearing a burden of redemption, forced to sacrifice himself for the future of the species. This imagery is reinforced throughout the film. Neville is hunted, isolated, branded a heretic by the family, and ultimately dies in a posture resembling a ritual execution. That death is not meaningless. Immediately afterward, the serum is carried away to save the survivors perfectly, aligning with the Christian theological motif of death leading to life. 11. Casting a Hollywood choice that was ahead of its time. Few people realise that the scene where Neville and Lisa stand in a luxurious apartment overlooking a devastated Los Angeles, then unexpectedly touch each other, as if they were the last two people who still understood what it meant to be human, was not merely post-apocalyptic romance. It grew out of a fairly risky casting decision in 1971. The role of Robert Neville was given to Charlton Heston, who at the time was already a proven box office guarantee after a string of major films. Universal needed a star capable of carrying almost the entire movie on his own, and Heston fit that requirement precisely. Rosalind Cash was cast as Lisa, creating an interracial pairing that was rare in mainstream entertainment cinema at the time, perfectly in line with the film's spirit when the world has collapsed. Old social boundaries become meaningless. On the opposing side was Anthony Zerby as the leader Matthias, along with the members of the family who felt both like a religious cult and a paramilitary force. These casting choices defined the film's tone, not simply the last man shooting zombies, but a confrontation between the individual belief and a frightening new order. 10. Charlton Heston's method of isolation. Do you remember the scenes of Robert Neville talking to mannequins in a department store, or muttering to himself in an empty apartment overlooking a dead city? Those moments were not just scripted, they came directly from the way Charlton Heston prepared for the role. To understand the mindset of the last survivor on Earth, Heston isolated himself for several weeks before filming. He limited contact with family and friends, lived alone with monotonous, repetitive routines, simply to observe the psychological effects of prolonged loneliness. Later, he admitted that by the third week he had begun talking to himself not as an acting exercise, but as a natural reaction of a mind under isolation. These experiences directly shaped the character of Neville. Daily rituals such as shaving, exercising, and cleaning his weapons were not merely about survival, but about clinging to sanity. Talking to mannequins reflected the most basic human social need when there is no one left to answer back. 9. An interracial romance that broke barriers. Do you remember the scene where Neville and Lisa stand together amid a devastated Los Angeles, two human beings clinging to each other at the end of the world? That moment, quiet yet heavy, carries far more weight than a conventional love story. The relationship between Robert Neville and Lisa is one of the first serious interracial romances to appear in mainstream Hollywood cinema. In 1971, this was not a safe choice. But the post-apocalyptic setting transformed what had once been considered controversial into a fundamental question. When humanity faces extinction, what meaning do the boundaries constructed by society still hold? Charlton Heston himself saw this relationship as an ideological pillar of the film. To him, Lisa was not merely a love interest, but proof that humanity still possessed the capacity to transcend its self-created divisions, even when it might already be too late. Their tragic ending does not negate that message. On the contrary, it makes the film more honest. Progress is not always rewarded, but the act of daring to cross prejudice remains an action of deep moral value. 8. Los Angeles after the apocalypse. Do you remember the scene of Robert Neville driving alone through empty Los Angeles boulevards? Not a single person in sight. No engine noise, only the morning sunlight reflecting off lifeless buildings. That world was not created with special effects. It was the real Los Angeles filmed while the city was still asleep. The post-apocalyptic streets in the Omega Man were shot at dawn before the city woke up. No fake backdrops, no matte paintings, just familiar avenues briefly stripped of human presence for a few short hours. That reality is what makes the imagery so unsettling. The audience is not seeing a distant future, but their own world, simply without life. The cast admitted that the experience had a powerful psychological impact during filming. Charlton Heston described the feeling of walking through a silent city as if civilization itself had taken its final breath. 7. The plague that predicted our fears. Do you remember the scenes of abandoned laboratories where human bodies lie motionless under cold fluorescent lights, while Robert Neville quietly draws his own blood to experiment in desperation? That moment is what turns the plague in the Omega Man from a piece of science fiction into something genuinely frightening. The disease in the Omega Man is not a convenient fictional invention. It was built on real research into biological warfare during the Cold War, a period when both laboratory accidents and military experiments were constant sources of anxiety. The pandemic in the film not only wipes out most of humanity, but also transforms the few survivors into light-fearing believers of an extreme ideology. It is a double fear, science spiraling out of control and society collapsing under distorted belief systems. Charlton Heston later admitted that the idea felt completely plausible, not like distant science fiction. Rosalind Cash also recalled that medical consultants at the time expressed genuine concern about how rapidly biological weapons research was advancing compared to existing safety measures. 6. Omega Who. Do you remember? These melodies implies cue music after this line. The cool, groovy, distinctly 1970s score of the Omega Man does not sound familiar by accident. It was composed by Ron Grainer, a name that may not be widely known to general audiences but is legendary among science fiction fans. He was the composer of the Doctor Who theme in 1963, the eerie electronic motif that became one of the most recognisable sounds in television sci-fi. Grainer was closely associated with British television. Beyond Doctor Who, he composed music for The Prisoner Steptoe and Son and the film To Sir with Love 1967. That is why his sudden involvement in a violent, mutant-filled, post-apocalyptic Hollywood film like The Omega Man felt unusual. Yet, it is precisely this tonal mismatch that makes it work. Grainer's music blends funk jazz and electronic pop typical of the era, carrying both the kitsch of the 1970s and enough darkness to suit a collapsing world. The score does not try to scare the audience, it makes them feel alone. That is why it is often cited as one of the key elements that give the Omega Man its distinct personality, setting it apart from other post-apocalyptic films of its time. 5. A scene too dark to make it to the screen. There is one notorious scene that was cut from The Omega Man, and it could have been a very powerful moment. The scene goes as follows. Lisa goes to a cemetery to visit her parents' graves. There she witnesses a female mutant disposing of the body of a dead mutant child. Lisa watches the scene but cannot bring herself to kill the mutant because she sees the pain and loss on the face of a grieving mother. Lisa returns and tells Neville what she saw. Neville asks whether she took care of it. Lisa explains that she could not kill a mother in mourning because she herself is pregnant. Neville is immediately shocked, and then he and Lisa embrace. It is not hard to understand why this scene was cut. It is too dark, too humane, and it could have pulled the film away from the action survival rhythm the studio wanted to maintain, especially since the ending is already tragic in tone. Still, the detail remains intriguing. In the end credits, the character woman at the cemetery is listed and credited to actress Anna Aries. This has led many to believe that the scene was actually filmed and only removed during editing. If this footage still exists somewhere in the Warner Brothers archives, its discovery would not only be a gift to fans, but also offer a different, more humane perspective on the brutal world of the Omega Man. 4. A mixed initial reception. The Omega Man was released in July 1971 and earned a tidy but not spectacular profit of $4 million. Interestingly, it made more money than Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. A major event film also released in 1971, which actually came out 1 month earlier. According to themnumbers.com, Willy Wonka earned only $3.4 million. The Omega Man did not receive strong reviews from critics. Most responses were merely average, with many criticisms aimed at the ending or at the film being too over the top and too fast-paced. Even the author of the original novel, Richard Matheson, disliked the film and seemed deeply unhappy with the changes made to his story. Time, however, reversed that judgment. The Omega Man gradually became a cult film openly admired by directors such as Tim Burton. Unlike the novel, which embraces the end of humanity as it is known, the film chose a more optimistic path, preserving humanity at all costs. That very choice, once mocked by critics, is precisely why the Omega Man has endured aged with defiant dignity and continues to be discussed more than half a century later. 3. Changes in the screen adaptation. There are quite a few major differences between the Omega Man and the novel I Am Legend on which it is based. The most significant change lies in the origin of the catastrophe. In the book, the disease is spread by bats and mosquitoes, turning humans into vampires. In the film adaptation, however, co-writer Joyce Hooper Corrington, a PhD in chemistry, felt that this explanation was outdated. She updated the story with a more modern fear biological warfare, which in the film is attributed to the aftermath of a conflict between Russia and China. The second major difference is the character of Robert Neville. In the novel, the final twist reveals that Neville himself is the monster, a threat to the new order of an evolved humanity. The Omega Man completely removes this ambiguity. Charlton Heston's Neville is constructed as a clear saviour figure, even carrying Christ-like symbolism with an ending defined by sacrifice. Although this choice sacrifices some of the philosophical depth of the original text, it makes the film more accessible and better aligned with the heroic spirit of Hollywood at the time. Ironically, later adaptations would continue down this same path, turning Neville into a symbol of hope rather than a remnant of a world that has passed. 2. A producer who collaborated many times with Charlton Heston. It is often said that the wheels of the Omega Man were set in motion on a night flight when Charlton Heston was travelling back to Los Angeles and happened to read I Am Legend. He immediately recognised the story's strong cinematic potential especially if placed within the atmosphere of anxiety that defined the early 1970s. Some accounts also suggest that Heston was unaware that an earlier adaptation, The Last Man on Earth, had already existed. According to IMDb, he initially approached Orson Welles to direct, but the plan quickly fell apart. Eventually, American director Boris Sagal was chosen. Sagal had a solid background in television, having directed episodes of The Twilight Zone. Alfred Hitchcock presents Columbo and The Man from UNCLE. The producer of The Omega Man was Walter Seltzer, a longtime collaborator of Heston, who had previously produced several films starring him, including The Warlord Will Penny and Number One. This working relationship continued afterward with Skyjacked Soylent Green and The Last Hard Men. Clearly, Heston and Seltzer understood each other well, so much so that simply looking at their shared filmography is enough to show this was no accidental partnership. 1. Not the first adaptation and not the last. The Omega Man is based on Richard Matheson's 1954 novel I Am Legend, as you already know. Beyond this book, Matheson also wrote The Shrinking Man numerous episodes of The Twilight Zone and the classic screenplay duel. Before The Omega Man, the story had already been adapted once in 1964 with The Last Man on Earth, a black and white film starring Vincent Price with the main character renamed Robert Morgan. In 2007, Hollywood returned to the material with I Am Legend starring Will Smith this time, keeping the original book title and completely reworking the depiction of the infected. Notably, I Am Legend is also widely regarded as a direct inspiration for George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. At one point, Hammer Horror even planned to make its own version, but the project was abandoned for being too gruesome. In other words, this is a story that gave birth to an entire post-apocalyptic lineage, and the Omega Man is just one very distinctive chapter within it. So what about you? Which moment from the Omega Man is the one you remember most? Leave a comment, and if you want to continue unlocking other deleted scenes from Hollywood's golden age, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. You may be surprised by what Hollywood has kept hidden for decades.